Hello everyone, this is John from the podcast staff, and before we start with the episode, we wanted to give a quick heads up about a recent development. One of our most prolific writers, Logan Marie Glitterbomb, is currently facing charges in Florida for self-defense. We're calling on you, our friends and supporters, to help us raise funds for Logan's legal fees in order to keep her out of prison. We need to raise approximately $10,000 to cover legal defense and related expenses, and while it's a steep goal, we're confident our network is capable of getting us close, and we'd like to thank you all in advance for engaging in such a powerful form of mutual aid. If you can, and only if you can head over to our fundraising page, and you can find a link in the description of the show. Thank you very, very much, and we hope you will enjoy the episode.
Hello, and welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio. This is Alex McHugh, back with part 2 of my interview with Aurora Apolito and William Gillis. If you missed part 1, that was released earlier this month and can be found on the C4SS website or on Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Just search for Mutual Exchange Radio. In the second part, we dig a bit more into some potential disagreements, some hypothetical questions, and a discussion about the different levels of abstraction at which one can consider the problem of decentralization and economic coordination. As a reminder, our two guests are Aurora Apolito and William Gillis. Aurora Apolito is a mathematician and theoretical physicist. She studied physics in Italy and mathematics in Chicago, and she later worked for various scientific institutions in the US, Canada, and Germany. She also works on mathematical linguistics and on mathematical models for neuroscience, and has authored 6 books on various aspects of this work. I should note that Aurora Apolito is a pen name meant to differentiate the research we talk about here from her work in other fields. Our other guest is William Gillis. Will is currently acting as technology coordinator at C4SS and was formerly our coordinating director. Will is a second-generation anarchist who's worked as an activist in countless projects and capacities since getting involved in the lead-up to N30, which is also known as the Battle in Seattle. Gillis studies high-energy physics and has held a deep fascination with the egalitarian potential of markets since 2003. Their writing can be found at c4ss.org, as well as humaniterations.net. I'll note, as I did in the previous part of this interview, that Will uses Aurora's real name a few times as we're discussing things. Since this wasn't a huge secret, we opted to leave that in, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. That's why you'll hear me and Will use different names through some of these questions. Without any further ado, let's get into part 2. Thank you. Yeah, I will fully admit I did not understand most of the actual mathematics in your essay, but I'm confident I got the concepts and how they were related after going through it a couple of times. But yeah, thanks for going through that. And from here, I want to go back to Will. So something Aurora just mentioned was this tendency in markets as we see them, capitalist markets, to accumulate wealth in the hands of few and sort of get out of hand in doing so in a snowball effect. So, Will, in your response essay, you focus on the argument that capitalist accumulation patterns are largely the result of state intervention and wouldn't be features of stateless markets. So this seems like a good time to talk about, what do you see as those anti-accumulationist features of the market?
Sure. So let me try to address a few things first before I go into all of those. So Matilda's talking about how we shouldn't weld epicycles onto epicycles, and maybe we should, start with an entirely new paradigm in order to analyze this. And I support that broader work, although I'm a little skeptical as to its success, or the possibility for its success. But I will say that, it's not as though we haven't seen broadly egalitarian societies with markets in the past, or more egalitarian than their surrounding, equivalent civilizations or things along those lines. There are historical examples of markets throughout the archaeological record. In fact, there's almost no human society ever that didn't have trade and circulation of trade goods through that economy. It's just as there's always some variation, some level of property according to some, with some provisos, with some limitations. There's always something along those lines. These things emerge for reasons. And even if it's a little bit reactionary for me to be we should look at what has historically worked in the past in this regard, I do think it's worth examining why those things keep coming back into play. The other thing that I would say is that it's not just that accumulation patterns are merely the result of state intervention. And I think it's important to make clear that the language in the discourse can get a little sticky around this point. I would say that rather the distinction about capitalist accumulation patterns in the present or in particular markets in the past, usually under imperial conquests and like other sorts of situations of domination. The things that are distinct that allow for kind of runaway growth of inequality involve state intervention, but they can also involve systematic violence that extends beyond the formal state itself. And they can be perpetuated like in compounding ways by accumulative tendencies that dominate in domains far away from equality. So it's not just that, the bounds of the formal state itself, I think most anarchists will understand, is not the bounds of anyone who's wearing a badge versus someone who's not wearing a badge. In many ways, like, corporations function as extensions of the state. Their limited liability is backed by the state. There's a broader regime of power that the state enforces. We can even talk about how, like, local gangs on the level of, like, the Bloods and the Crips or, like, MS-13 or whatever, Aryan Brotherhood, that all these are perpetuated by the state itself and by the power relations and the dynamics that the state creates. The capitalist, like, brutal, red in the tooth and claw sort of accumulation tendencies of the modern world are in many ways reinforced structurally, incentive-wise, culturally, individually, personality, all in so many different ways by conditions the state creates and maintains because those, in turn, those broader systems reinforce the existence of the state. How many times have there been situations where the state creates the gangs or the enemy or the terrorist or whatever that then it poses itself as the solution towards? But that doesn't mean that the terrorist group terrorizing a population is itself truly like outside of the state in some sense. But even if you are to mark it as like outside of the state, I think it's still worth noting that group or that spinoff of the power structures of the broader state and the other entity within the broader ecosystem of power dynamics and competition, that those other things themselves help reinforce the cumulative tendencies of the state. So you might be like, the Aryan Brotherhood does not constitute as a state. And I'm like, okay, well, regardless of whatever definition you choose for that, the Aryan Brotherhood still perpetuates through its violence, through its whatever accumulation patterns. So I wanted to be clear around, first off the bat, that there are a variety of different dynamics that can reinforce accumulative patterns in capitalism. And I also, before that, wanted to really state that, like, but historically, the accumulative patterns of capitalism and similar societies are relatively unique. And we don't really see them that strongly everywhere in the historical record. So we should really be looking at, like, what is distinct about this sort of, like, structure. It's important to note that like fascism and other enemies of the state are themselves dangers. And while they have state-like behavior as a whole, the goal of an anarchist or a more liberatory society, if, you don't even want to speak of like an anarchist society, is a set, fixed, accomplished future state. We still have to deal with the fact that there are things that need to be suppressed in order for like a free society to function. And that's not just the formal state. It can be things like the KKK, decentralized populist racism. I mean, lynchings themselves were not necessarily like the product of the state in a direct, clear-cut way, although, some of the times the participants wore badges themselves. But they don't have to wear badges to reinforce the broader power structures of the state. And of course, like, when you look at lynchings of Black people, those ultimately serve the interests of the capitalist class and the broader patterns of accumulation inside of that society. So there are a variety of different things that a free society will have to suppress, not just the state itself, but a variety of different things that look like the state. And there are also the things that the state created. And I think even the libertarian Murray Rothbard had a line that I love using against libertarians, which is that he was basically like, if you were to privatize the Soviet Union into the hands of 50 or 100 people, it really wouldn't change anything. Like, now there'd be a formal property system and like 100 people would own all the property of the Soviet Union. But like, that's still functionally a state in terms of what anarchists are critiquing, regardless of whatever term you apply to it. So in the same sense, like the misbegotten wealth that has accumulated through capitalism and enclosures and the vast history of violence and, oppression and systematic distortions, from little things like tariffs to, all sorts of different things. All those accumulations that have built up over the last centuries or whatever, those themselves are extensions of the things that we have to fight. And we're not going to be able to, completely kill the state if there's somebody with billions of effective dollars in wealth who can just buy his own private army, right? So there's a variety of different things that have to be fought. And I want to be extra clear that I'm not just saying that the horrors of capitalism are merely the product of like intellectual property law or subsidies to the transportation networks that provide goods in such a way that like Walmart is a massive beneficiary of state power and it drives down, small businesses or whatever. There's a variety of other things at play here. But as to anti-cumulative tendencies, there's maybe like 5 big categories of anti-cumulative tendencies that we can find in markets already or in societies already and different dynamics already, and that need to be like, I feel like focused on in our attention. One is the pretty trivial one that like profits go to zero under ideal decentralization and competition. We obviously don't live in anything close to that. That's part of the reason why like capitalism is so distinct from, a true, more pure, freer, more liberatory market system that is more decentralized. So ultimately, if the profit margin that a business can make or a cooperative or, a free contractor can make on a truly competitive or free or whatever market is relatively minimal, then that may still be enough to drive investment and things along those lines, but it's not sufficient to, accumulate vast sums of wealth in one person's lifetime. The second big category of anti-cumulative tendencies is illegibility. So the proper free markets, markets that are more decentralized, that are less shaped by systematic violence, that have more egalitarian wealth distributions, tend to be more illegible. There's high legibility in some ways. The price system still functions in a variety of different ways, but there's local knowledge, there's competitors, there's, folks who it's more of a complex sort of mess in general. And you can read a variety of different scholars on how black markets and like small urban markets and things along those lines are structured in ways to avoid taxation and the pressure of the state, but, just generally to avoid like any outsiders or people who are not invested in some way from like really understanding the relationships, the personal connections, the market conditions, the contingencies, et cetera, those things. And so it becomes harder and harder for a multinational external or a centralized system or whatever to fork off 1,000 McDonald's and embed them in local markets, because that McDonald's would have to invest an incredible amount of money to be able to like adapt to that local market dynamic and situation and culture and what have you and landscape. The relationships, the sort of local or the norms, the supply chains, those things along those lines become less visible at the macro scale, and that level of legibility can constrain the capacity for large, at least at a certain scale, entities from existing or profiting. Third level of anti-cumulative tendency that can be stoked in the market is diseconomies of scale. So basically, we kind of covered this a little bit before, but, big corporations suffer the same inefficiencies that the Soviet Union did. They oftentimes are completely irrational in the ways that they allocate resources internally. There is no real deep coupling of supply and demand, or, there's no real tight feedback loops. Rather, you get absurd managerial classes that grow fat on whatever they can, parasitically derive from the system. There are structural tendencies to encourage those kind of managerial classes. The shop floor gets deeply disconnected from those who are making the decisions, but also as the business scales up in size, and again, this is a diseconomy of scale in terms of a single collective decision-making structure. So whether that is made by, whether that collective, that entity, that group has that decision made by, a single person or a board of directors, or whether that's made by consensus or direct democracy by all members of that group, there's still limitations on the size that group can grow to. And that's part of the thing I was talking about in terms of interfacing, if you have a workplace with 150 people making decisions in that workplace, is going to get harder and harder and harder, and there are going to be inherent limitations there. Those diseconomies are basically subsidized by the state right now. So the state has a vested interest in large corporations that are roughly the same size, or roughly closer to the scale of the state. It can regulate and understand those companies better. It can interface with them. They're legible to the state. In partly they're legible just because it has to be so stupidly simplistic that a taxation structure or a managerial structure can even to any degree function within that apparatus. Additionally, you need like the corporations themselves or the large entities of whatever form. And this can even, this can talk about like the structure of like a business, but it can also be like a billionaire, because somebody who has $1 billion in resources is, by basic subjective theory of value or by marginalist analysis, he's going to be able to just have less attention. He can focus on the allocation per dollar that he invests. And this means that, he's probably not as good of an investor as, if you spread out those $1 billion to, 1,000 people. So, and let those 1,000 people make those investments autonomously among themselves. So like billionaires are also centralization of wealth and control infrastructures. Billionaires are basically, Soviet commissars, central planners themselves. And a dollar up, a dollar down for them doesn't matter as much as like, somebody on the shop floor. A dollar up, dollar down matters to them. So anyway, the state has a variety of reasons to basically make to offset these diseconomies of scale, and to say that like, okay, well, we're going to punish things that are below a certain scale, and we're going to provide handouts to things above a certain scale, like, oh, you're too big to fail, etc. But there's also the dynamic of like, once these entities are big enough that they occupy significant market share, not only do you like certain like different domain tendencies in terms of like market dynamics start to take over, where you get essentially dynamics where something is like a seller's market or a buyer's market of labor or whatever, where there's so few actors who control so much of the market that they effectively set prices relatively trivially. You will not only get those dynamics of power that reinforce themselves, but you also get regulatory capture, where the corporations or the large businesses or the billionaires or whatever are able to, basically capture whatever regulatory apparatus the state has. They are able to pay off politicians and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, from the state itself against small competition. So, for example, why Jeff Bezos wants a $15 minimum wage is because he wants to drive out the small competitors against his business. And, he'd prefer to not pay $15 at all. But if something's on the table, he is very, very happy to adopt $15 an hour, so long as it's inflicted upon all of these small cooperatives or mom and pop shops or whatever that are competing with him, so they can drive up his market share. So all of these ways in which the state reinforces and counters these diseconomies of scale, these companies, these billionaires, whatever, would not be making real profits at the scale they would have. They would be eaten up on a real free market, because they just are so irrational in their investments. And we can look at that in terms of so many examples in like Silicon Valley, or like whatever, of like dumb apps that are like not actually a good idea, but they can get billions of dollars like misallocated into them. Anyway, misallocation is like a widespread dynamic as a consequence of diseconomies. The fourth example of anti-cumulative tendencies is directed sanction. So in this one, you'll find it in marketplace basically in the world. If you go there and you look like a rich person, you're going to pay a much higher rate at that market. So if you wander into, a large open market in Bolivia or in India or wherever there's like those kinds of autonomous, like almost black market or gray market, kind of large scale, bottom up societies or systems, projects, somebody will size you up pretty quickly. And then much more if they know you as part of the community as like the rich person, they're going to just charge you more for an item than somebody else, because of subjective theory of value. They know that it means the dollar that you're spending there means less to you. And further, like, okay, so you can pay somebody else to buy the good for you, but then you're going to be paying somebody else to buy the good for you. So you're losing money no matter what. This functions basically as a consequence of subjective value, and the fact that everyone kind of like recognizes that plays out in terms of how people evaluate money and resources and stuff. But it also it depends upon non-anonymity. Most markets, historically speaking, were public ledgers where participants were like visible. Anyway, so shooting past that onto the fifth element, there's also, if all those other things don't manage to suppress the emergence of accumulative runaway power or wealth, the response is, well, ultimately, at some level, property titles themselves and respect for them is emergent from, reputation and norms and culture and things along those lines. It's kind of like an agreement, autonomous, bottom up emerged in the community, and it can be more fluidly renegotiated. So like in some contexts, it makes sense to have property rights or property titles over some things. And in other contexts, it does not make sense to have titles over those things and to treat them more collectively. It depends highly upon like the situation, the context that you're in, the culture, the aggregate desire for some things versus other things, the need, for, I'm not just talking about goods, but also in terms of like broader social, like norms and values. And then there's also the issue of like, if I am tolerating the sovereignty of your house in return for you not invading the sovereignty of my house or, whatever, then if at some point I'm made homeless and you own all the houses, there's really no incentive on me anymore to respect your claim to own these houses. It's just that claim is kind of meaningless. Title claims are not objective. It's not just values that are subjective, but title claims, there's no such thing as an objective property title. So as a consequence, in a lot of societies, the pressure valve is that basically theft, and in some sense theft is a valid component of a market. You go to some places and a rich person accumulates way too much money on the market locally, and then people just stop respecting some of his claim to that wealth. That's actually something that just kind of emerges fluidly, and they're like, oh well, today we just all this we've just kind of all decided that you do claim that you got all those things, but really you don't get that much, you just have this much. Who are you to say that your claim to those things is more valid than our evaluation of where the property titles are distributed? There are obviously dangers to that kind of evaluative model. You obviously want a norm where property has some level of fixedness, where people's possessions or whatever are not randomly deprived from them. But a lot of that is culturally contingent. A lot of that is contingent upon the situation and also the value of it. If somebody, according to strict Lockean property, tills the entirety of a planet and changes the soil in some way that conceivably creates value, if value is subject, anyway, there is a direct relation towards recognizing some subjectivity of value and then recognizing that property titles themselves have to be non-objective. But if somebody were to till the soil of an entire planet and develop an entire planet, and then a population is born there, the person who claims the property title to the entire surface of the planet may have valid claim according to Lockean or Rothbardian notions of property, but it's clearly non-functional, right? He can't be the other people don't have exit, they don't have a variety of other options. They're basically slaves or feudal serfs in that context. And so basically what would any sane society would do is just deny him his claim to own the entire planet. So that's one kind of pressure valve that emerges that can relieve these kinds of cumulative problems if they emerge. And the other thing I want to note is that a free market or a market form can provide what people want, and there are a variety of different things that we could call a free market. But, culture and social norms and activism and things along those lines deeply structure what emerges and what sort of market we get. There's no single absolute abstract thing is the free market, right? There is the ideal of liberation of the market. There's the ideal of a market freed from powers or from domination, from systematic violence, from historical theft and accumulation. But the market can still provide various sort of conclusions or various sort of emergent norms given the people that exist within that market and the things that they decide upon organically bottom up, right? So if a society decides to boycott X, X will, as a whole, X will probably not exist in that market, but it takes a certain amount of effort to get that boycott off the ground. That's not something that just we, throw up our hands and sit back passively from. Markets are a tool, not a god. They are something that we feed our values and our work and our effort and our continued struggle into to shape in a more positive direction. If a market is simply created, and it can be nominally free in the sense of free of states or, systematic violence. But if the thing that, people desire is suffering or ecological destruction or things along those lines, then that's what the market will try to efficiently provide for those people. And so there's a variety of different other, things that we have to shift and change. The anti-cumulative tendencies of markets are essentially knobs or, adjustable dials in some sense, not as a central planner, but as something that emerges from the ground up that we can, contest and struggle over and shift so that, we don't have markets where slavery emerges because people don't see anything wrong with owning other people and the property dynamics extend to that. Obviously we have to aggressively struggle against that kind of thing and persecute anything that remotely looks like that. Additionally, there has to be a market in suppressing slavers, right? There has to be a variety of different an activist and external social civil society structures and things, emergent tendencies, fan groups, culture, what have you, that suppress those kinds of things. Boycotts are asymmetric structures. So they tend to work better for more altruistic people who are willing to self-sacrifice a little bit to get the boycott to function. And it tends to be boycotts tend to be harder to leverage for people who are more sociopathic and in those situations where there aren't like systematic or institutional structures that basically make the boycott impossible. Is, like right now, you can boycott meat at the store, but Safeway still can buy the same amount because like price signals don't even really function. And ultimately, at the end of the day, state regulation manages to suppress basically anything or any real like consumer preferences. But in like online or something along those lines, in terms of just like free association, boycotts of individuals who are like rapists, abusers, destructive profiteers, etc., racists, etc., those can be quite effective at suppressing those kinds of things. But those are, again, things that we have to, proactively build ourselves. A market does not just flip a switch and then, everything is good. Yeah.
Thank you. Aurora, do you want to respond to anything there?
No, I mean, not particularly. We can just continue.
Okay.
Questions.
Sounds good. I think I want to jump ahead a little bit. So one of the things that came up just now when Will was speaking was this sort of disagreement that I see in your two perspectives between objective value and subjective value. So why don't we start with you, Aurora? If you could talk a little bit about objective valuation, what do you mean by the term, and why you would favor a system that operates under assumptions of objective value.
Right. So I actually borrowed, the term from the very first paper that Kantorovich wrote on programming, the one in 1939. And let me just say this, that, in a sense, what one wants to design or one wants to study is a kind of optimization problem. And in general, optimization problems usually consist of two parts. There's a minimization problem and there's a maximization problem. And so the kind of minimization problem that I think is so in a sense what I want to say is that the minimization problem I think can be more easily fit within the framework of methods that are already well established. For example, the work of Kantorovich. And what I mean by that is that, even if you assume that we could be, envisioning, a post-scarcity scenario where energy production is widely available and inexpensive. Imagine that we have, perfectly renewable energy, or that clean fusion reaction works and is really energy is readily available with essentially without cost. You would still inevitably have some issues about minimizing waste, and what I mean by that is that even in a situation like that, not all the chemical elements have the same distribution in the universe, so there will still be chemical elements that are rare, and that therefore you don't want to waste if they need to be employed in a production system, and so there will still be certain properties that have an intrinsic kind of difficulty of availability, and that's just for basic issues of science of chemistry. So, and also so if you have certain procedures of production, you will still have some that are more wasteful in terms of the environment and in terms of, and you want to be trying to aim at minimizing those wastes. So the minimization problem is actually, in a sense, well taken care of by this kind of economic analysis, like that has its roots in the work of Kantorovich, and so that, in a sense, I think is a part of the optimization problem where one can largely rely on methods that are well established. The question that I think is more delicate is what is the maximization part of the optimization problem. So in a sense, in the usual kind of market economy, when maximizes for profit or some kind of like that. And that's exactly the kind of things that, in my view, I would like to avoid. And the one thing that I was especially focusing on in this essay is this issue of maximizing for complexity. And that's a very subtle concept. So one has to be very careful about what one means by, optimizing for complexity. But I mean, the reason I said at the beginning that I think this is the first necessary step for anything else. So the first thing I wanted to discuss is how one can try to aim for an optimization in terms of complexity. And also, this has something to do with how one envisions, the things like planning and coordination in a system. And, that these things seem at first unrelated, but, to me, the way to think about terms like planning, coordination, and also centralization, in a sense, is in terms of the theory of complex networks, because that's in the end, if we want to talk about a scaling problem, that's in the end what we are looking at. We are looking at a very large network, or actually what people you think as a multi-network, where you look at different kind of networks at different scales that interact with each other, or different kind of network that describe different kind of production, interaction, distribution, and so on, that have mutual interaction and mutual information flows between them. And so the point is, this is the structure over which your optimization process has to happen. And so it means that what you're looking at is the structure, the geometry of the network itself and all its interaction becomes a part of this optimization process, and the other part is how you aim at trying to maximize complexity. So let me first say something a little bit about what I mean by complexity, because this is it's easy to if one thinks in terms of the intuitive notion of complexity, and even if one thinks in terms of the mathematical notion of complexity, it's very easy to get things that don't actually correspond to what one would like to have. The very basic way that mathematicians think about complexity is the notion of Kolmogorov complexity. And this can be described very easily as the shortest algorithmic description of how you produce something. And so, for example, if I tell you, I describe a number as write the number 0 1,000 times, right? So saying write the number 0 1,000 times is much faster, is much shorter as a description than actually writing down 1,000 zeros. So this number has small Kolmogorov complexity. If I give you like a completely random number of 1,000 digits, then there's no shorter way to describe it rather than writing out these 1,000 digits. So this works well for a lot of purposes, but it's clear that there's a problem with this, right? It gives very large complexity to very random things, and that's not what we want. So obviously, you don't want this. This is a bit like this my objection that Will was making in his reply. It's not what you want to maximize. That notion of complexity is not uninteresting. So the point is that one wants to modify it so that it looks more like our intuitive notion of complexity as something that's highly structured. And Kolmogorov's complexity is just giving maximal complexity to things that are very unstructured. So this was actually a problem what mathematicians have thought about for a long time. And so Murray Gell-Mann, theoretical physicist and mathematician, had actually at some point proposed a different notion of complexity, which she called effective complexity. And in a sense, it's meant to capture highly structured subsystems of a given, the presence of highly structured subsystems in a given system. So there's like a more precise way of saying how you obtain that. And I think that I don't want to get too technical, but these are not complicated, concepts. They are a little bit subtle, so one needs to think about it for a moment, but they are actually, not difficult. Right? So the way that he said to describe what effective complexity should be is to say that you actually minimize the Kolmogorov complexity over all the possible statistical ways of choosing, let's say a procedure that will produce what you're measuring the complexity of, right? So you have a statistical ensemble of such possible ways of producing, right? And over all the ones that you can use to produce a certain outcome, you actually minimize the sum of Kolmogorov complexity and Shannon entropy for reason. But basically, the point is that you're actually looking for places where, within the pattern that are consistent with your outcome, where the Kolmogorov complexity drops. Okay. And that's a way of thinking about that. So here's something that looks a little bit strange. I'm saying that you want to maximize complexity, but I just told you that this effective complexity is actually minimizing a form of complexity and information over a certain ensemble. So it seems like there's a bit of a contradiction between this, but it's not. It's really, again, one of those situations where the best kind of the optimization is coming out of a combination of a minimization and the maximization. So you first do this minimization to extract the actual essential complexity, in the sense of this effective complexity in the sense of Gelman. And then that's the thing that you want to maximize rather than maximizing the Kolmogorov complexity. And just exactly avoiding the kind of things that, look complex but are meaningless. Right? This is actually would give very small effective complexity to those, but would give high effective complexity to things that have actually interesting structure in them. And so I gave one example, which is based on art, where this maximization with this effective complexity can be measured, and so it's it can be applied. I made that example for various reasons, which maybe we'll talk about later, but also because it's an example of how this can be applied to actual things of value. Which, the slogan goes, things of value have no market value, but this is an example where it has, value in this sense of, growing complexity. So that's what I want to know. But the other side is the one that involves the geometry of the network. And so this optimization, if we see, we want to grow this effective complexity. And we want to grow it in a way that also involves the network structure. And that's where the way I'm proposing to do that is actually based on adopting an idea that was developed in neuroscience first. And it was developed as a kind of attempt to propose a computational model for consciousness in neuroscience. As a computational model for consciousness, it has some drawbacks. It might actually give some possible necessary condition for consciousness, not the sufficient condition that people were hoping it would give. But, it has interesting properties, and that's the reason why I think it is an idea that can be relevant here. So the idea is this notion of integrated information. And, what that measures is the amount of informational complexity in a system that cannot be reduced to the individual components of that system, cannot be broken up into the individual parts of the system. Right? If you want, you can think of it as a kind of mathematical way of describing what people call holistic in normal language, or it's a way of describing what a collectivity gains that is not already that is emergent and is not already present in its separate parts. So the original idea of this integrated information is based on a way of computing Shannon information, Shannon entropy over a network in this way that sort of measures, the amount of information that's not present in the separate parts. But I want to apply it not to Shannon information, which is a little too coarse as a concept, but to this Gell-Mann effective complexity. And so that would actually optimize it, not just per se, but optimize it over a network in such a way that, it maximizes the amount of interplay between, or amount of coordination, to use, the term that this really is standing for, within the network. And so, what I'm trying to propose, so actually what I'm just about to say right now is an idea that in a sense goes back exactly to this tradition of a cybernetic communism that was being developed in the 60s in the Soviet Union as an alternative to the authoritarian centralized planning of the Soviet state. And one idea they had, which I think was very crucial and very important, is the fact that planning should be an emergent property of a network. And this seems like a contradiction, because you think of planning as something that you have to do beforehand or a priori. But this is really not the idea. The idea is that the network does the planning itself through an optimization process. And there's this, it's like saying, okay, instead of, for example, instead of assigning, working committees or assemblies and decision-making processes, communities emerge spontaneously from the network, and the planning is coming from the dynamics of the network and of the, quantities, like the example of effective complexity that are associated to that. And so there's this joke that communists like committees, which I think is bullshit. I mean, blast all committees. I mean, these things should not be run in the planning in this traditional sense. Planning should be dynamical and part of the structure of the network, enriched with this kind of what I refer to as objective values. But what I mean is functionals that optimize the flow of information and the complexity and other quantities of this kind associated to the network. And so that's the way that I view these values in this form. And I've only just barely scratched the surface in this essay, and I plan to return to that in a much better form, hopefully in another one, on specific ways that, what I call the instruments of connectedness and complexity, in which this optimization process can happen. And these, of course, are a very important part of, stepping down from the very theoretical side to an actually more practical side, and is something that, definitely needs to be expanded much more than what I was able to do for now in this essay. But at least this is the general picture of how I see this in this model, how I view these things.
Yeah, I think there's, we're using value at like different levels of analysis. So if there's a confusion there, I think that Matilda is looking at value in terms of like maximization of the whole system. And, I could similarly provide value in that context, but I think that becomes more like in terms of how I would do those values to be in terms of more like moral values for like the whole of the system, in terms of positive freedom or maximizing agency for the individuals involved. And we might think that see that as I would frame like maximizing freedom as like the ultimate emergent value, or like the summary of, the ultimate conclusion of all values. But that's like a different sort of notion of value. I think the more subjective value dynamic that you were saying when I was referencing subjective values and things along those lines is more in terms of just like, in the actual applied real world, in real human beings, rather than, the abstract, ultimate, angelic, fully ethical, ascended philosopher, geniuses. we each have, each human brain is a bundle of different values and desires and like tensions and virtues and whatever, like all kind of like commingling and intention at different points. And these values in this sense can be as trivial as like liking chocolate or bubble tea or what have you. And these things conflict with one another and are also incredibly hard to evaluate. And so Matilda is talking about how there's one like, essentially evaluative criteria, not one, but describing an evaluative criteria that can be put across network structures as a whole to evaluate like what would optimize that network structure, hopefully in the sense of like also optimizing, provision of goods and services or whatever to people, or, satiating desires to get in a more base like level. But I think that because this work is so preliminary, it's important to note that, like the answer that could be spat out of those conclusions could be a market, right? Like it's a different paradigm, which Aurora intends to take in the direction of in the direction of communism, but we don't really know how that gets evaluated out. And it entirely bypasses the problem of like knowledge issues. So, you can have like a cybernetic communist, like, network structure where in some ways these evaluations are being made and that determines like the structure of like, server nodes on the network. But as to, evaluating art or evaluating individual desires or like, situational allocation of resources and contexts and things along those lines, there's still the question of like, how do you integrate local knowledge in an effective way, given that there are still human beings with limited brains, limited communications channels, and there are still issues in terms of weighing desires and things against one another. And there's like the issues of, trade-offs, et cetera, that give rise to the necessity for trade, at least in my argument. And so the entirety of the like, how do you get information from the base level and integrate that all the way up? Like I could see this maybe being like an effective evaluative or like, perspective if we were fully ascended, like hive swarm, nanotechnology, AI God, whatever sort of things. But as limited human beings in the present, language is just an inherent barrier. Communication of the things that are inside of our heads to others is very hard to do. And while there may be benefits, and there certainly are benefits to be found, although the degree to which those benefits can be found in terms of better collaborative software, networking capacity, decision-making, forums, et cetera, all those kinds of things, those can certainly be optimized to some degree. I just, I see no evidence whatsoever that they can be optimized to the degree where that can bypass or do, a situation that, a cybernetic communist arrangement that's entirely those kinds of like dynamics and involves no, spot checked like trades or investment or, like anything along those lines. I don't see how that can function and get accurate information or integrate that information. I think, this provides the scaffolding of how those things could be integrated if you could get past that step, but I just don't see that step, as like summitable. And I look forward to whatever Matilda writes or does work on with regards to that component of the overall structure.
Yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about at the top in terms of being a little bit at odds in terms of where these different projects are. So with that, I think we've covered a lot of the things that I wanted to get into with this interview. And we are coming up on about 2 hours. So I'm going to propose one more serious question and then my fun one. Does that sound good?
That sounds fine.
All right. So the last serious question I want to ask is, what level of scarcity or post-scarcity are you both assuming would exist under a sort of post-capitalist world? So like when I picture an anarchist future, I imagine things being only slightly less scarce than under capitalism, but with people generally better set up to help each other get through that. So I'm curious what kind of framework you each went into this with in terms of assumptions about scarcity.
Yeah, so I was really trying to avoid making a specific assumption on the level of post-scarcity that one wants to assume, except for this fact that, I mentioned explicitly the fact that even if you assume like the best possible post-scarcity scenario, you are still going to inevitably have some kind of scarcity, which is just based, for example, on the different statistical distribution of the chemical elements in the universe, right? So, I mean, there's no perfect post-scarcity in a sense. That's one thing that I want to definitely assume. on the other hand, the actual level of post-scarcity could be very variable. I mean, one hopes and definitely think is technologically feasible that energy scarcity would be something that one can get past. That environmentally sustainable sources of energy that are not scarce would be something that we will be able to assume in envisioning an anarchist future. To what extent, that of course will depend on the development of science and technology, and it could vary quite a bit. So I think, as much as possible, at least at the level at which one is thinking about the general theoretical framework, I think it is better not to make a very specific assumption about the level of post-scarcity in which this framework is going to function, because there's a very broad spectrum about what one could envision, and it's better to try to make something that does not depend on very specific assumptions there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also trying to avoid any specific evaluation or level of scarcity. I think that obviously at a certain level of a lack of scarcity where, you can dream things into existence and there's infinite energy and blah, blah, blah. Obviously economics goes by the wayside, and also at a certain level of intense scarcity and demand and need, it's simply just infeasible to have complex economic systems whatsoever. But, I think that the phrase that you used, Alex, slightly less scarce than capitalism, is probably a pretty good frame. There's a couple things I nuance though, is there's a ton of industries and goods that will not be sustainable or producible in an anarchist society. And I think that's something we need to really recognize. If consumers right now had to directly pay to offset the full externalities of certain goods, those goods wouldn't be produced. NASA had a study on this. I mean, I'm sure they've had multiple on this. There's been many people who have done these kind of evaluations, although they come to somewhat varying conclusions. Generally though, the evaluation is that pretty much half of present industries, or at least products, wouldn't exist if, people had to pay the price to offset the environmental damage that those, or to more stringently limit the environmental damage done by production of those goods. So, one of the things that I think there's great possibility for markets to do is to find reporting and property and et cetera systems that effectively manage to internalize externalities like this. And further, I think that it's definitely the case that some goods then in a real free market where the state wasn't subsidizing certain things, we wouldn't get some things. There are some things, or industries or technologies that would be suppressed in favor of others. And I think that that's something that's very important to, continue to keep centered in anarchist thought. But, of course, even, that's true, but it's going to happen on the margins. The destruction of industries, there may be no more of this produced in mass, but there are still edge cases where for medical things, it's really necessary on the margins we're here. So the need is so high. And so the price is willing to be paid to offset the environmental consequences of that, et cetera. But there are I think it's important to note that capitalism has detached prices from costs in a lot of ways. And one of the great benefits of the market system is the evaluation of trade-offs, or the potential evaluation of trade-offs, even if that isn't really something that we see under capitalism right now. So we would see, people would pay higher prices for some things if they were even purchasable at all. And then second, I think it's important to emphasize that a transition to a free society should make things cheaper and less scarce. And the reason for that is just kind of strategic, because if we don't provide a lesser degree of scarcity, I'm not going to say post-scarcity, because there's never really such thing as post-scarcity. There's always, less than infinite supplies of everything. Salt and pepper used to be hugely valuable commodities, and now you can, steal them free from McDonald's. But there's still limits to them. You can't, steal giant tons of, black pepper. But we do want to dramatically decrease the scarcities, or, increase abundance and efficiencies in a variety of ways. And I think strategically the reason we want to do that is because if we don't do that, the transition to a free society will just be harder, and the result will be less stable. If you were to collapse society to subsistence farming tomorrow, and in the process do away with the state and all that stuff that we oppose, a huge sector of society, including people who right now are working absolute shit jobs or in otherwise terrible situations when capitalism would flock to any and all fascists, neoliberals, whatever, that would promise a return to the existing order. And that's not, you can talk about like false consciousness and brainwashing and whatever, but I think that like ultimately at root, what the leftists really need to come to bear with or to terms with is that people have desires, and those desires are, both in terms of like social freedoms and in terms of material freedoms. They want physical options in their life, and technology and abundance and stuff like that provides that. And people are sometimes willing or can be led to make some trade-offs where they trade off social freedom for material freedom, or where they get in zero-sum game sort of dynamics and oppress others. And so if we don't just, stick our hands in the sand and ignore that, if we actively pay attention to those needs of people, then we can better handle the strategies around transforming society, however incrementally or drastically or, partially we managed to accomplish that. Yeah. I also quickly, before we end here, I wanted to nuance. I made a mistake earlier in the talk. I said I noted Yale in the Unabomber, but it was a brain fart of mine. He went to Harvard, so the book in question was Harvard and the Unabomber when I was talking about anti-STEM tendencies that started to emerge in the two cultures war in the 1950s from certain aristocratic and Heideggerian kind of tendencies in the humanities. So the book is Harvard and the Unabomber. Sorry, just Harvard and Yale. They're the same thing in my head for some reason. So
arguably, yeah, that's all the same world out there.
Uh-huh.
Awesome. So yeah, with that, I just have one final sort of fun question. Speaking of desires, what good or service, if you could ensure one, would you want to make sure was available? I mean, Will, you were just talking about how, in a post-capitalist world, we're going to have to accept that some of these things just won't be produced anymore. So if you could ensure that one thing continues to be produced and available and all of that, what would it be?
Well, it's such a broad question because there's an infinite number of goods and services, and many of them are incredibly critical to human existence. So, you could ask the question, I could answer the question sorry to be a total fucking, actually nerd about this, but I could answer the question in the most general sense and be I want to make sure that humans still have oxygen in the future and that the service or good of oxygen is still provided to them. Right. And so there's a huge level we could go through needs and things along those lines. And then there's more the vagaries of a market or culture and what would change, what might change and what might be de-emphasized. And then there's the what sort of things are do I think are critical, but that society as a whole might ignore, or that, I would really work on. So I think if we were going to go through a transitionary, I mean, it's kind of silly to think of progress in these terms, but there's a revolution or a broad social paradigmatic change or something. And, a system of a period of struggle or turmoil or whatever. And the new order is built, and obviously an incomplete and imperfect order as we ever strive towards anarchy, as Malatesta said. I would be most focused on making sure that global connectivity and the internet and that kind of stuff retains, relevance and presence in people's lives, so that, the options of that kind of mass sociability are still available. If the question is more, but I think that, a lot of people are going to be working on that, and that's obviously something that a lot of people would desire. So if you're looking for something that's more particular and less ethical and broadly strategic for all of society, more fun little thing. I'm on the record of being a massive Star Wars fan. So I hope that post intellectual property, there are people collaborating on making new content that in the Star Wars universe or whatever, as just sort of a fun thing on the side. And I would to continue to see new episodes of, I don't know, The Mandalorian or something, but, I'm more than happy to sacrifice that to have a freer society.
Yeah. So, well, that maybe the fun answer is books. But, since that's slightly more, in a sense, you see the question, to take it a little more seriously, is that a lot of these good, services and things that would be really crucial to ensure are an interconnected network, exactly this kind of multi-layered network that I was talking about. And so isolating just one level of it is be difficult. But maybe, something that we'll also mention, in a sense, I think what would be crucial is actually as a service to provide free access to knowledge to everybody. And of course, things like the internet have done a lot to go in that direction. One thing that, of course, we do see a lot right now is the fact that there's an enormous amount of information available and disinformation. One of the question is, having a mechanism that provides people with access to knowledge and also with access to a way of determining, the value of what is available as information. And, this is a very pressing problem, I think, right now, because we see a lot of people going off into weird conspiracy theories or weird pseudoscience, and you want to, have some ways to actually provide people with ways of discerning, non-expert people with ways to discerning what is knowledge that, is going to be important and useful and what is crap. And of course, if one doesn't want to go down the postmodernist, and claim that there are all alternative facts and alternative, realities. But, I have seen some interesting proposals recently of trying to actually have ways of detecting, for example, pseudoscience or detecting by a kind of computational mechanism, precisely in terms of things like complexity and if you have these conspiracy theories that are unbelievably complicated but extremely non-complex in an effective complexity sense. And so I think what I would like to see is free access to knowledge for everybody. Eliminating all intellectual property and paywalls and things that prevent people from accessing, the scientific literature and the, whatever culture that is being produced. And also ways for non-experts to be able to discern between what is available, things that are actually valuable.
Yeah, thank you both for indulging me on that question. I'll admit that when I wrote it, I was thinking along the lines of, I really hope that peanut M&Ms continue to exist after capitalism.
Right.
But I think both of your, more serious, more thoughtful answers were also, really interesting in that they reveal something important about what makes a good society, right? Access to knowledge, interconnection with people around the globe. And I think it's important to keep those kinds of things in mind while we talk abstractly and theoretically about what a free society might look like. So yeah, thanks so much for indulging not only that question, but this entire interview. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say or end on before we close this out?
No, thanks for organizing this and entertaining us for this journey. And yeah, I just wish everybody to keep safe in the coming times and keep up with the activism. And it's going to be, probably we're going through some really difficult times, but I just wish everybody to keep strong and keep safe.
Yeah. We're recording this, I think, 2 weeks before the election. And so I think no one here has any real idea how that's going to turn out. Or, one way or the other, the state will continue to stay in power, but what are the forces of reaction? What are the lay of the land in terms of infrastructure and activist struggle and all those kinds of things? So yeah, all of that continues to be certainly pressing. And I hope that everyone holds on and does well. I also hope that folks, speaking of things to preserve through into the future, continue working or valuing the preservation and construction of our alternative infrastructure. And, also hope that, maybe things go perfectly well and the neoliberals, maybe retake the state and then we fucking crush them under our boot. Who knows? So whatever ends up happening, This was a fun little aside and a nice little discussion. I encourage everyone to go back and read Aurora's and my pieces on c4ss.org, where, we were probably a little bit more eloquent than we were on this interview and able to go in more detail.
All right. Well, thank you both again. The essays are in the show notes, and I'm just going to echo that hope that both of you do very well in the coming times, get through them safely, and that we all come out of it on the other side doing all right. And with that, thank you for listening, and a big thank you to our supporters on Patreon for making this all possible. I'd like to give a specific shout out to all of our associate level sponsors for the month. So huge thanks to Jason Turner, Lindsay Jane, Curtis Ekman, Jacob Sipkin, Casey Jamil, Derek W., David Colborn, DT, Humanisphere, Alex Gutowski, Danny O'Brien, Acknerals, and James Tuttle. Your support keeps this show running, and we truly appreciate our patrons at every level. If you're not already a supporter of the show, head on over to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's www.patreon.com/c4ssdotORG. And you can help us out for as little as $2 a month. And even that, goes a long way towards keeping us afloat. So thanks again, and see you next month.